So as you may have guessed by the title, the Falcon has entered the new age. We now have lithiums aboard. There are plenty of videos out there that list the pros and cons of lithiums versus AGMs. That is very well documented. So what we thought we'd tell you about instead is what that means in real life and the power problems that we experience when we're sailing. To do that, I need to take you back to our trip sailing from Cape Verde to St Martin. We started the trip with absolutely full batteries, so that's 450 amp hours in our AGM battery bank.
We've got 800 watts of solar, 400 watt wind generator, 100 amps on the alternator, and a 2 kVA petrol generator.
Within a few days of setting off, we started to have power problems.
We're gasping for power, and that's with modest usage. We had a hydrovane, so no autopilot. We're not using laptops, we're just using iPhones for entertainment and just standard instrument array. Nothing fancy, no radar with guard mode or anything Gucci like that. And we were still gasping for power, and that's because we're running downwind, there's no wind, so the wind generator's not spinning. We're going east to west, so a portion of the day the panels are shaded by the massive array of sails we needed to keep moving. So our choices to repay the daily debts that were accumulating thick and fast is 1, to burn diesel with the inboard engine and the alternator, or 2, use the petrol generator. Now, to be going so slow so soon in a 3-week passage, you don't really want to be burning diesel just to keep the lights on. So we opted to use petrol instead, and we lashed the petrol generator to the mast. That was fine and it did work, but because of the AGM's woeful charge acceptance rate, we were running the generator for 3 hours a day to make it through the night. Fortunately, we had plenty of petrol and the generator's quite efficient, but when you're accumulating 80 amp hours of debt each day and it takes hours to pay that back on a petrol generator, you're sort of doomed from the beginning. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute Adam, your math doesn't really add up. You told me you have 450 amp hours of AGM batteries and you're accumulating sort of 80 odd amps per day of debt and you're out of power in a couple of days. It's like, well, you're right, the math doesn't add up. But AGM amp hours and lithium amp hours are not created equal. And the reason for that is that you can only ever discharge an AGM battery bank to sort of approximately 50%. Beyond that, you significantly age the batteries and you can actually kill them. So in a couple of days you can understand why we're gasping for power. On top of that, AGMs suffer the curse of pretty horrendous voltage drops. So a resting AGM bank sort of at the full position, not under load, sits at somewhere like 12.7 volts. Your appliances, your fridges and things, they need sort of 12 and change and they'll cut out at 11. Now, when your battery bank drops, you don't sit at 12.7 anymore. You start to sit unloaded at 12.5, 12.2, 12.3. Then you apply a load, you turn something on, you turn the chart plotter on, the autopilot kicks in, and that voltage drops even more. Now that starts to bring in cascading failures and sort of things start to misbehave, and like your fridge, for example, might pop briefly below its cut-off minimum voltage, which means that the compressor switch is off. When the voltage starts to get dangerously low and things start to give up the ghost or misbehave or not operate sort of as well as they should, you really do need to address that problem. Now, the petrol generator is pretty efficient and it can put out, I think ours is 80 amps at flat out, right? When you start it up, the revs pick up and it sits nicely at 80 amp hours and you're like, yes, here we go. Come back in about 4 minutes and it's down to 60. You come back in another 20 and it's down to 40. And then it'll sit there for a little while and then it'll drop again. And then you might have 50, 60 amp hours left to go and you're bringing in 12, 15 amps. And that's because the charge acceptance rate of an AGM battery, it peters off quite dramatically. You may be in the audience going, well, get a bigger alternator, get a bigger engine, get more solar, get more wind generators, whatever. But it's important to note that the AGM acceptance rate is the bottleneck. If the AGMs can only accept so much, well, everything else is just creating heat and wasting diesel and petrol. Like a good analogy would be like, you can make $1 million a year, but if you can only ever have $100 in your pocket and everything else gets given away, well then you're not that rich, are you? But you take us back through the story and I will segue in for what the scenario will be had we have had lithium.
Okay, so we started out with 600 amp hours of lithium now. So we started our journey...
First thing to say. Sorry. 100 amp hours of lithium is not the same as 100 amp hours of AGM. You can only ever use 50% of the AGM hours. So whilst we had 450 AGM hours, we can only use 225. We have 600 amp hours of lithium, And you can really only go down to like 20% to be sort of the best practice, if you will, maybe 10%. But for ease of math, let's just call it an even 100%.
Yep.
So we have usable 600 amp hours.
So we start. We then are...
Whoa! No, I'm kidding, I'm joking. I don't have anything.
We're a couple of days underway.
3 days in on the AGM side, we were like gasping for power.
Yep.
Right, so we've tripled our bank. So we should get 7 to 9 days before we have to work, are in the same predicament.
All right.
But you're not in the same predicament because the voltage wouldn't have dropped off. What prompted us with the AGMs to charge the batteries and like panic and turn things off and start to sort out how we're going to get this power back is because the voltage dropped under load through the night and things started misbehaving and not working.
The phones wouldn't charge. I mean, come on.
Couldn't watch my movies. Lithium, for example, it sits at, I think, 13.3, 13.4 when it's full and it's resting. If you were to turn a kettle on, which is like a significant draw, it'll drop by, I think we checked it, it's 0.2 of a volt.
Yep,
and it'll do that
Yeah.
most of its way through the life, so things don't start to fail the way they would.
When we finally start to think, okay, we really should top this thing up, then what happens?
We could have started the diesel engine and just motored for an hour and actually put in 80 amp hours.
Okay.
As opposed to the AGM scenario where we would have put in the first 10 minutes, it would have been 80, then it would have been 40, then it would have been 20. With the lithiums, because it's the same right across, the solar panels would have probably been more effective. So in the limited time in the sun that they did get, they would have put out maximum power for longer. They can't put out more power, but they can. The batteries can take maximum power for longer, and thus your solar panels are more efficient. So that would have been maybe notable. I don't know. I'd love to. I'm looking forward to the next big passage to check that out.
Despite all the problems that we had while underway, we did manage to arrive safe and sound, still hating our AGMs, but eventually when we did arrive in St Martin, we got some lithium batteries in. We have now installed them, and here's pretty much a summary of our installation. Our inverter charger was built a very long time ago. So this was swapped out with one that not only worked with lithium batteries, but can now power our electronics more efficiently with pure sine waves. We increased our 450 amp hour battery bank, 50% of which was actually usable, to a 100% usable 600 amp hour battery bank. The batteries are actually in. Apparently they are significantly lighter than our AGMs, which are currently lining the floor. Thinking that the whole process seemed relatively straightforward, and with an extra set of hands to help us, we knuckled down and got wiring. And at the end of the first day, we finished up in the dark and decided to try our new system.
All right, here we go.
Nothing blew up!
Nothing happened either.
Yeah, but are all the...
Yeah, the cabin lights are... breakers are closed.
As you can see, it's well past dark, so this might have to be a job for tomorrow. But we did kind of want the win by the end of the day, so... Leaving it for the day, we came back the following morning and got to work, chasing up more wires. It's a really fun time. The label time.
How's it feel to have more power than you know what to do with?
We haven't actually used it yet, so I'm used to just being like, turn the fan off, turn the inverter off, turn everything off.
You know, I would give back all that power just to have somewhere to sleep tonight. It's getting a bit late in the day, and the sun is fading, and we're pretty much done. We could pack up, but I don't want to have to open it all up again to tie up loose ends. Yeah. So we're trying to get everything completely done, but.
And I have to say as well that because we are quite an old boat, we have a lot of legacy wires going around and floating around. So we have taken longer, I think, than what a newer boat would take, because we're like, where does this wire go? Why is the fridge suddenly not working? What about this one? Where's that? And you're tracing all these wires. If it were a slightly newer boat which had...
We would have been done yesterday.
Exactly. Or a boat that had already been rewired, we would have been finished easily.
And to be fair, most of the problems we had were because we were changing the system, and so we had to undo a lot of the old system before we could put the new one in, and quite substantial stuff, like not just changing a few wires here and there, like O-gauge wires from the engine bay back to the batteries, and extra runs and cutting, like just lots of extra stuff that you wouldn't have to do if it was a drop-in solution like most people would have. So it actually was wildly, the batteries themselves were like a drop-in solution.
Ironically, it was at this time that our camera battery actually ran out. So here's how we set up our lithium batteries.
So, really simple setup, much like last time with a few modifications here and there as required. We have the 600 amp lithium bank, which goes to 2 bus bars, one for positive, one for negative. There is a Victron BMV shunt between the negative side bus and the battery negatives, so that we can figure out how much current we're spending and the battery voltage and all that kind of stuff. From there, we have 800 watts of solar and 400 watts of wind generators, which are both hooked up via their respective controllers to the positive negative bus bar. From there we have the large alternator, which we'll talk about later, and a surge protection device. Now this is super important in any lithium system. I've said it before, I'll say it again because it's important. Your batteries, being lithium, have a BMV, they can shut themselves down. They can protect themselves, which means your alternator, if there is no surge protector, is pumping out current and suddenly it has nowhere to go, and that's how we destroy alternators. So if you don't have one, get one, if you're hooked up this particular way. So the alternator and the surge protection device runs parallel across the alternator terminals, or in fact anywhere across the lines for the alternator that is convenient. The alternator itself is hooked up directly to the positive side of the bank and the negative bus bar. From there we have a starter battery. So the difference between last time and this time is that this time we're cranking from a lead acid battery. Last time our system was so we would have AGMs and we would crank from the AGMs, and we had a selector that would allow you to switch over to the backup battery and crank from that, which means that the house bank and the starter battery, auxiliary bank, was connected to the starter motor. We've not done that now. Now we have a starter battery, a designated cranking battery that is hooked up to the starter motor, and that starter battery is trickle charged in a way through a DC to DC charger, which is hooked up across the lithium house bank via the bus bar. So when you turn the motor on, the cranking battery cranks the motor turns the alternator charges the lithium house bank, and the DC to DC charger goes, hey, the motor's on, we've all got lots of power, I will commence recharging the cranking battery. So it all stays happy. And then from there we have the inverter charger, which provides us with our AC loads, which is hooked up across the positive negative bus bar and sends AC loads to all of the sockets and the various things around the boat. And that's it. It should go without saying that this is a simplified version of the system. There are fuses in here that aren't included. There are isolation switches in here that aren't included. There are charge controllers in here that aren't included. I've just done this for illustrative purposes so you can see the general layout of the system and the key takeaways. Hope you took something from that video. I hope it's helped you. I hope it's a different take on the lithium conundrum, whether it's worth it, whether you should do it.
It's nice to, I think, for some people to see the real life example. We just want to thank Dakota Lithium as well. Batteries are awesome. And if you enjoyed the video, put a thumbs up, subscribe, and join us for more adventure later.